Chapter 56. Augustus was a little put out with himself for doing such a poor job of tracking. He'd gambled on Blue Duck heading west when in fact had crossed the Red and gone straight north. It was the kind of gamble Call would never take. Call would have tracked all the way, or let Dietz track. The country near the Canadian was rough and broken, and it dropped south to where the plains flattened out. He wanted to spare his horse as much as possible. He rode east all morning, a bad feeling in his heart. He had meant to catch Blue Duck within a day, but he hadn't. The renegade had out-traveled him. It would have been rough on Laurie, such traveling. He should have borrowed Call's mare, but the thought hadn't occurred to him until too late. By this time, Laurie could be dead, or ruined. He'd helped recover several captives from the Comanches in his rangering days, and often the recovery came too late if the captives were women. Usually their minds were gone. They were only interested in dying, which they most likely did once they got back to people who had let them die. He was thinking about Laurie when the Indians broke for him. Where they had hidden he didn't know, for he was in the center of a level plain. He first heard a little cutting sound as a bullet zipped into the grass 10 yards from his horse. Later, the sound of bullets cutting grass was more distinct in his memory than the sounds of shots. Before he really heard the shots, he had his horse in a dead run heading south. It seemed to him there were 10 or 12 Indians, but he was more concerned with outrunning them than getting a count. But within minutes, he knew he wasn't going to be able to outrun them. He had pushed his horse too hard and soon was steadily losing ground. There was plenty of ground to lose, too. He had hoped for a creek or a bank or a gully, something he could get down into and make his stand. But he was on flat prairie as far as his eye could see. He contemplated turning and trying to charge through them. If he killed 3 or 4, they might get discouraged. But if there was even one man among them that had any sense, they'd just shoot the horse, and there he'd be. He glimpsed something white on the prairie slightly to the east and headed for it. It turned out to be just more buffalo bones, another place where a sizable herd of animals had been slaughtered. As Augustus raced through the bones, he saw a wallow, a place where many buffalo had laid down and rolled in the dirt. It was only a slight depression on the plain, not more than a foot deep, but he decided it was best he was going to get. The Indians were barely a minute behind him. He jumped down, pulled his rifle and cartridge rolls clear of the horse, dropped them in the buffalo wallow. Then he drew his knife, wrapped the bridle reins tightly around one hand, and jabbed the knife into the horse's neck, slashing the jugular vein. Blood poured out, and the horse leaped and plunged desperately, but Augustus held on through the sprayed blood. When the horse fell, he managed to turn him so that his horse lay across one end of the wallow, his blood pumping out into the dust. Once the horse tried to rise, but Augustus jerked him back, and he didn't try again. It was a desperate trick, but the only one he could think of that increased his chances. Most horses shied from the smell of blood. He needed the horse for breastworks anyway, and he could have shot him, but he saved a bullet and the blood smell might work for him. As soon as he was sure the horse was beyond rising, he picked up his rifle. The Indians were shooting, though still far out of effective range. Again he heard the zing of bullets cutting the prairie grass. Augustus rested the rifle barrel across the dying horse's withers and waited. The Indians were yelling as they raced down on him. 1 or 2 carried lances, but those were mainly for show, or to puncture him with if they caught him alive. Sure enough, when they were 50 or 60 yards away, their horses caught the first whiffs of fresh blood, still pumping from the torn throat of the dying horse. They slowed and began to rear and shy. As they did, Augustus started shooting. The Indians were dismayed. They flailed at the horses with their rifles, but the horses were spooked. 2 stopped dead, and Augustus immediately shot their riders. He could have asked for no better target than an Indian stopped 50 yards away on a horse that wouldn't move. 2 men dropped and lay still. Augustus replaced the 2 cartridges and wiped the sweat out of his eyes. The blood had brought him a chance. Without it, he would have been overrun and killed, no matter how fast or how well he'd shot. Now the Indians were trying to force their horses into a charge, but it wasn't working. The horses kept swerving and shying. Some tried to circle to the south, and when they did, they turned. Augustus shot 2 more. Then one Indian did a gallant thing. He threw a blanket over his horse's head, got the confused horse to charge blind. The man seemed to be the leader. At least he carried the longest lance. He charged at the wallow, rifle in hand, lance in the other. Though when he tried to level the rifle with one hand, he dropped it. Augustus almost laughed, but the Indian kept up the charge with only a lance, a brave thing. Augustus shot him when he was no more than 30 feet away. He let him get that close in hopes of grabbing his horse. The Indian fell dead, but the horse shied away, and Augustus didn't feel he could afford to chase him. The remaining Indians were discouraged. 5 Indians were dead, and the battle not 5 minutes old. Augustus replaced his cartridges and killed a 6th as the Indians were retreated. He might have got one or two more, but he decided against risking long shots when his situation was so chancy. There might be more Indians available nearby, though he considered it unlikely. Probably they had charged with all they had, in which case he had killed half of them. With no shooting to do for a little while, Augustus took stock of the situation and decided the worst part of it was that he had no one to talk to. He had been within a minute or two of death, which could not be said to be boring exactly, but even desperate battle was lacking in something if there was no one to discuss it with. What had made battle interesting over the years was not his opponents, but his colleagues. It was fascinating, at least to him, to see how the men he had fought with most often reacted to the stimulus of attack. P.I., for example, was mostly concerned with not running out of bullets. He was extremely conservative in his choice of targets, so conservative that he often spent a whole engagement sighting at people but never pulling the trigger. "Could have wasted a shell," he said, if someone pointed this out to him. It was true that when he did shoot, he rarely missed, but that was because he rarely shot at anything over 30 yards away. Call was interesting to observe in battle, too. It took a fight to bring out a fighter in him, and a fighter was mostly what he was. Call was a great attacker. Once the enemy was sighted, he liked to go after them and would often do so in defiance of the odds. He might plan elaborately before a battle, but once it was joined, his one desire was to close with the enemy and destroy him. Call had destruction in him and would go on killing when there was no need. Once his blood heated up, it was slow to cool. Call himself had never been beaten for good. Only death could accomplish that, and he reasoned that if any enemy was alive, he wasn't beaten either, not for good. Augustus knew that reasoning wasn't accurate. Men could get enough of fighting and turn from it. Some would do almost anything to avoid the fear it produced. Dietz understood that. He would never fire on a fleeing man, whereas Call would pursue a man 50 miles and kill him if the man had attacked him. Dietz fought carefully and shrewdly. He would have known the trick about fresh blood, but Dietz's great ability was in preventing ambushes. He would have seemed to feel them coming, often a day or two early, when he could have had no particular clues. "How'd you know?" they would ask him, and Dietz would have no answer. "Just knew," he said. 6 remaining Indians had retreated well beyond rifle range, but they weren't gone. He could see them holding council, but they were 300 yards away, and the heat waves created a wavery mirage between him and them. Unless there were more Indians, Augustus didn't consider that he was in a particularly serious situation. It was hot, and the blowflies were already buzzing over the horse blood, but those were trivial discomforts. He had filled his canteen that morning. The Canadian was no more than 10 miles to the north. More than likely, the Indians would decide they had missed their big chance and go away. They might try to get him at night, but he didn't plan to be there. Come dark, he would head for the river. All afternoon, the 6 Indians stayed where they were. Occasionally, they would fire a shot his way, hoping to get lucky. Finally, one rode off to the east, returning about an hour later with a white man who set up a tripod and began to shoot at him with a 50 caliber buffalo gun. That was an inconvenient development. Augustus had to hastily dig himself a shallow hole on the other side of the horse where the blood and blowflies were worse. They were not worse, though, than the impact of a 50 caliber bullet, several of which hit the horse in the next hour. Augustus kept digging. Fortunately, the man was not a particularly good shot. Many of the bullets sang overhead, though 1 or 2 hit the saddle and ricocheted. Once the buffalo hunter was reloaded, Gus took a quick shot at him, raising his barrel to compensate for the range. The shot missed the white man, but wounded one of the Indian horses. The horse scream unnerved the shooter, who moved his tripod back another 50 yards. Augustus kept low and waited for darkness, which was only another hour away. The shooter kept him pinned down until full dark, but as soon as it was too dark to shoot, Augustus yanked his saddle loose from the dead mount and walked west, stopping to take what bullets he could salvage from the men he'd killed. None had many, but one had a fairly good rifle, and Augustus took it as insurance. He hated carrying the saddle, but it was a shield of sorts. If he got caught in open country, it might be the only cover he'd have. While he was going from corpse to corpse collecting ammunition, he started to hear the sudden rattle of shots from the east. That was puzzling. Either the Indians had fallen to fighting among themselves or someone else had come on the scene. Then shots ceased and he heard the sound of running horses. The Indians leaving, most probably. This new development put him in a quandary. He was prepared for a good hard walk to the river carrying a heavy saddle. But if there were strangers around, they might be friendly and he might not have to carry his saddle. Possibly the scout for a cattle herd had stumbled into the little group of hostiles while the main trail routes lay to the east. At any rate, he didn't feel he should ignore the possibility, so he turned back toward the shooting. There was still a little light in the sky, though it was dark on the ground. From time to time, Augustus stopped to listen, and at first heard nothing. The plains were still. The third time he stopped, he thought he heard voices. They were faint, but they were white, an encouraging sign. He went cautiously toward them, trying to make as little noise as possible. It was hard to carry a saddle without it creaking some, but he was afraid to put it down for fear he could not find his way back in the dark. Then he heard a horse snort and another horse jingle his bit. He was getting close. He stopped to wait for the moon to rise. When it did, he moved a little closer, hoping to see something. Instead, he heard what sounded like a subdued argument. "We don't know how many there is," one voice said. "There could be 500 Indians around here for all we know." "I could go find them," another voice said. It was a girlish voice, which surprised him. "You hush," first voice said. "Just because you can catch varmints don't mean you can sneak up on Indians." "I could find them," the girlish voice insisted. "They'll find you and make soup of you if you ain't lucky," was the reply. "I don't think there's no 500, the third voice said. "I don't think there's 500 Indians left in this part of the country." "Well, if there was even 100, we'd have all we could do," the first voice pointed out. "I'd like to know who they were shooting at when we rode up," the other man said. "I don't believe it was buffalo, though I know it was a buffalo gun." Augustus decided he wouldn't get a better opportunity than that, so he cleared his throat and spoke in the loudest tones he could muster without actually shouting. "They were shooting at me," he said. "I'm Captain McMurtry and I'm coming in." He took a few steps to the side when he said it, for he had no men to shoot from reflex when they were frightened. Nothing was more dangerous than walking into the camp of a bunch of men who had their nerves on edge. "Don't get nervous and shoot, I'm friendly," he said, just as he saw the outline of their horses against the sky. "I hate this walking around in the dark," he added loudly, not that it was much of an observation. It was designed to keep the strangers from getting jumpy. Then he saw 4 people standing by the horses. It was too dark to tell much about any of them, but he dumped the saddle on the ground and went over to shake their hands. "Howdy," he said. And the men shook hands, though none of them had yet said anything. The surprise of his appearance had evidently left them speechless. "Well, here we are," Augustus said. "I'm Augustus McMurtry, and I'm after an outlaw named Blue Duck. Have you seen any sign of the man?" "No, we just got here," one of the men said. "I know about him, though," July said. "My name is July Johnson. I'm sheriff from Fort Smith, Arkansas, and this is my deputy, Roscoe Brown." "July Johnson?" Augustus asked. "Yes," July said. "By God, that's a good one," Augustus said. "We were expecting you down in Lonesome, and here you are practically in Kansas. If you're still after Jake Spoon, you've missed him by about 300 miles. "I've more urgent business," July said, rather solemnly. To Augustus, he seemed young, although it was hard to tell in the dark. Mainly it was his voice that seemed young. "I see you brought family," Augustus said. "Most lawmen don't travel with their children. Or did you pick up these 2 sprats along the way?" Nobody answered. They simply stood as if the question was too complicated for an answer. "The Indians kill your horse?" July asked. "No, I killed him," Augustus said. "Used him before a fort. There ain't much to hide behind these plains, and I heard shooting. Did you kill any more of them bucks?" "Don't think so," July said. "I might have hit the buffalo hunter. We never expected to find Indians." "I killed 6 this afternoon," Augustus said. "I think there was 12 to begin with, not counting the buffalo hunter. I expect they work for Blue Duck. He stole a woman and I'm after him. I think he sent them bucks to slow me down." "I hope there ain't too much of a bunch," Roscoe said. "I never killed one before." In fact, he'd never killed anyone before, or even given the possibility much thought. Sudden death was not unknown in Fort Smith, but it was not common either. It had been a big shock when the Indians turned their guns on them and began to shoot at them. Not until he saw July draw his rifle and start firing did it dawn upon him that they were under attack. He had hastily drawn his pistol and shot several times. It had not affected the Indians, but it angered July. "You're just wasting bullets. They're way out of pistol range," he said. But then the Indians ran, so it didn't matter so much. "What's your plan, Mr. Johnson?" Augustus asked politely. "If your business is urgent, you might not want to slow down long enough to help me catch Blue Duck." That was true. July didn't want to slow down at all until he found Elmira. If he had been alone, he would have traveled 20 hours a day and rested 4. But he was hardly alone. Roscoe was nervous as a cat and spent all day talking about his worries. Joe didn't complain, but the hard traveling had worn him out. He rode along in a doze most of the time and slept like a dead thing when they had stopped. The only one who didn't suffer from the pace was Janie, who mainly walked. July had to admit that she was unusually helpful. When they stopped, she did whatever chores there were to do without being asked. And she was always up and ready to leave when he was, whereas Joe and Roscoe were so sluggish in the morning that it took them half an hour just to get their horses saddled. Now, out of the blue, a Texas Ranger had showed up, one of the very ones who had partnered with Jake Spoon. He was afoot and a long way from help, and they couldn't just ride off and leave him. Besides, there were hostile Indians around, which made the whole situation even more worrisome. "I haven't planned very much," July said honestly. "Seems like every time I make a plan, something happens to change it." "Well, life's a twisting stream," Augustus said. "Speaking of which, the Canadian River ain't but a short way to the north. Them bucks are probably camped somewhere on it." "What would you advise?" July asked. "You know the country." "It's a steep bank river," Augustus said. "If we have to fight Indians, we'd be in a lot better position there than out on this plain." "You say the man stole a woman?" July asked. "Yes," Augustus said. "A girl who was traveling with us." "Well, best go on to the river, I guess," July said. "You can ride with me and Roscoe can tote your saddle." "This boy ain't armed. Maybe he'd like a rifle," Augustus said. "One of them bucks I shot had a pretty good Winchester, and this boy looks old enough to shoot." He handed the rifle to Joe, who was so stunned by the gift that he could barely say thank you. "Is it loaded already?" he asked, rubbing the smooth stock with one hand. "You're darn right it's loaded," Augustus said. "Just make sure you shoot one of them, not us." He climbed up behind July and they rode north. Joe felt intensely proud now that he was armed. He kept one hand on the stock of the rifle, expecting that at any minute the Indians might attack. But the ride to the river was uneventful. It seemed they had not been riding long before they saw the silver band of the river in the moonlight. July stopped so abruptly that Joe almost bumped into his horse. He and Mr. McRae were looking at something downriver. First, Joe couldn't see anything to look at, but then he noticed a tiny flame of light far downriver. "That'd be them," Augustus said. "I guess they ain't worried about us, or they won't be so bold with their campfire. They don't know it, but the wrath of the Lord is about to descend upon them. I dislike bold criminals of whatever race, and I believe I'll go see that they pay their debts." "I best go with you," July said. "You don't know how many there are." "Let's go make camp," Augustus said. "Then we'll think it out." And they rode upriver a mile, stopping where the mouth of the canyon sloped down into the riverbed. "This is as good as we'll get," Augustus said. "What I'd like is the loan of a horse for the night. I'll have him back by breakfast and maybe a few others to boot." "You want to go at them alone?" July asked. "It's my job," Augustus said. "I doubt there's many of them. I just hope Blue Duck is there." Roscoe could not believe what he was hearing. He felt very scared as it was, and yet this stranger was prepared to ride off by himself. "Why, there could be 10 of them," he said. "Do you think you could kill 10 men?" "They're easier to scare at night," Augustus said. "I expect I'll just run most of them off. But I do intend to kill Mr. Duck if I see him. He's told his last woman." "I think I ought to go," July said. "I could be of some help. Roscoe can stay here with the young ones." "No, I'd rather you stay with your party, Mr. Johnson," Augustus said. "I'd feel better about it in my mind. You've got an inexperienced deputy with 2 young people to think about. Besides, you said you had urgent business. These things are chancy. You might stop a bullet and never get your business finished." "I think I ought to go," July said. It was in his mind that Ellie could even be in the camp. Somebody could have stolen her as easily as the Texas woman. The whiskey traders wouldn't have put up much of a fight. Of course, it wasn't likely she was there, but then what was likely anymore? He felt he ought to have a look, at least. In any case, the man could use help, and it should be no great risk to leave Roscoe and the young ones in camp for a few hours. They all needed the rest. Augustus realized he could probably use the help, since he didn't know how many men he was facing. However, he didn't have a high opinion of the average man's ability as a fighter. The majority of men couldn't fight at all, and even most outlaws were the merest amateurs when it came to battle. Few could shoot well, and even fewer had any mind for strategy. The problem was that Blue Duck was evidently one of the few who could think.
He had planned the theft of Lorena perfectly. Also had survived 20 years or more in rough country at a rough game and could be expected to be formidable if he was around. But probably he wasn't there. Probably he'd sold the woman and left, sending a few Kiowas down the trail to take care of whoever came along. It would likely just be a matter of shooting down 2 or 3 renegade buffalo hunters who'd been too lazy to find honest work once the herds petered out. Augustus was undecided as to whether he would be better off by himself or with the country sheriff from Arkansas. All he knew about the sheriff was that Jake Spoon had run from him, which wasn't much to go on. The young man had had no experience with plains fighting and perhaps not much with any fight. There was no telling if he could even take care of himself in a scrap. If he couldn't, he'd be better off left. But then, who would know until the fighting started? What happens to us if the two of you both get killed? Roscoe asked. It was a question that loomed large in his mind. Head back southeast as far as you can, Augustus said. Once you make it down below the Red River, you'll probably be all right. If you go east a ways, you ought to run into some herds. Why, we'll be back, July said. I ought to go help Captain McMurtry, but we'll be back. Augustus didn't feel right about it, but he made no further effort to stop July Johnson. They let the horses rest for an hour, then put Augustus' saddle on Roscoe's big gelding and left. When they rode up on the high ridge above the river, they saw again the little spark of light to the east and made for it. If it ain't prying, what is it, this urgent business you're on? Augustus asked. July was hesitant about answering. Roscoe and Joe had both looked at him strangely as he left, and the look bothered him. It was as if both of them were his children. Both looked to him for care. Only Janie seemed comfortable being left out on the Canadian. Well, sir, it's my wife, July said. She's gone from home. It might be that she got stolen too. Augustus felt that was interesting. They were both chasing women across the plains. He said no more. A man whose wife had left was apt to be sore about it, touchy. He changed the subject at once. Was your brother Jake shot? He asked. Yes, July said. I guess it was accidental, but I've got to take him back. Only I'd like to find Elmira first. They rode in silence for 7 or 8 miles over broken country. Augustus was thinking what a curious man Jake Spoon was, that he would let a woman be stolen and just go on playing cards or whatever he was doing. Every time they topped a ridge and saw the tiny flame of the campfire, July tried to calm himself, tried to remind himself that it would be almost a miracle if Elmira were there. Yet he couldn't help hoping. Sometimes he felt so bad about things that he didn't know if he could keep going much longer without knowing where she was. Finally, with the camp not more than a mile away, Augustus drew rein. He dismounted to listen. In the still of the night, on the open plain, voices could carry waves, and he might be able to get a sense of how many there were up against. July dismounted too and waited for Augustus to tell him what the plan was. It was only 100 yards from the river, and while they were listening, they heard something splash through the water downstream from where they stood. Could be buffalo, July whispered. We seen a few. More likely a horse, Augustus said. Buffalo won't cross that close to camp. He looked at the young man, worried by the nervousness in his voice. Have you done much of this kind of thing, Mr. Johnson? He asked. No, July admitted. I ain't done none. About the worst we get back in Arkansas are robbers. Let's walk our horses a little closer, Augustus said. Don't let 'em whinny. If we can get within 100 yards of their camp, we're in good shape. Then I favor charging right into them. They'll hear us before they see us, which will scare them. We'll be on them before they have time to think. Use your handgun, save your rifle. This will be close range work. If there's any left, we'll turn and make a second run at them. We mustn't trample the women, July said. We won't, Augustus said. Have you ever killed? No, July said. I've never had to. I wish you'd stay with your party, Augustus thought, but he didn't say it.